"Your 3 children are in there," said the girl to the Hell's Angel. In tears, but when they open, the morning fog hung thick in the air, mixing with the dark smoke that billowed from the old 2-story house. Molly stood at the edge of the growing crowd, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The flames reached higher, licking at the wooden siding and crawling up toward the second-floor windows. The heat pressed against her face like an invisible wall, making her eyes water. Or maybe those were tears. She couldn't tell anymore. Through the crowd, she spotted him, the man with the leather vest, standing near his motorcycle at the edge of the gathering. Even from a distance, Molly could see the winged skull patch on his back. Her teacher had warned her about men like him, men from the Hell's Angels. But something in her gut told her he was different. The firefighters were taking too long to arrive. The sirens wailed in the distance, but they sounded so far away. Inside the house, her siblings needed help now. Molly pushed through the legs of the onlookers, ignoring their startled looks and complaints. Her pink sneakers carried her straight to the big man with the motorcycle. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Tall and broad-shouldered, with arms covered in tattoos and a thick beard that couldn't quite hide the scar on his jaw. "Mister," she called out, her voice cracking, "please!" Frank turned, his weathered face showing surprise at the small girl suddenly beside him. His eyes, hard at first, softened slightly as they met hers. "You shouldn't be here, kid," he said gruffly, but there was something gentle in his tone. "Where are your parents?" Molly grabbed his rough hand, tugging with all her might. "Please," she begged again, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "You have to help." The crowd's murmuring grew louder as the flames reached the roof. A window shattered somewhere above, the sound like a gunshot in the morning air. Molly flinched but didn't let go of Frank's hand. "Your 3 children are in there," she said, pointing towards the burning house with her free hand. Frank's brow furrowed in confusion. "What? I don't have any—" "Please!" Molly's grip tightened on his hand. "They need help now." Something in her desperate plea cut through Frank's hesitation. Maybe it was the pure trust in her eyes, or the way her small hand clutched his so tightly, as if he was her only hope in the world. The crowd gasped as Frank suddenly moved toward the house. A firefighter who had just arrived tried to stop him, reaching out to grab his arm. "Sir, you can't go in there." Frank shrugged him off, his eyes fixed on the burning doorway. The heat was intense now, making the air shimmer. Without another word, he broke into a run, ignoring the shouts behind him. Molly watched, her heart in her throat, as Frank disappeared into the smoke-filled entrance. The flames roared louder, as if angry at his intrusion, and somewhere in the distance, more sirens wailed their approach. "Please," she whispered again, this time to herself, her eyes never leaving the doorway where Frank had vanished. "Please help them." Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The heat hit Frank like a wall as he charged through the crowd. Smoke burned his lungs, but Molly's desperate words drove him forward. He shoved past a burly firefighter who tried to block his path. "Are you crazy?" the firefighter yelled. "The structure's unstable." Frank ignored him. The crackling flames drowned out everything except the pounding of his heart. Inside, thick black smoke made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He dropped to his knees, crawling beneath the worst of it. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Anyone in here?" A small whimper came from somewhere to his left. Frank moved toward it, feeling his way along the scorching floor. The leather of his jacket protected him from the worst of the heat, but sweat poured down his face. Through the smoke, he made out 3 small figures huddled in a corner. The oldest, a boy around 9, held his younger siblings close. Their faces were streaked with soot and tears. "Come on," Frank said, trying to sound calm despite his racing pulse. "We're getting out of here." A thunderous crack split the air. Frank looked up to see ceiling beams starting to give way. They had seconds, maybe less. "Trust me," he said, extending his arms. The youngest child, barely a toddler, reached for him immediately. The 5-year-old girl followed, but the oldest boy hesitated. "Now," Frank ordered. The urgency in his voice spurred the boy into action. Frank scooped up the toddler in one arm and grabbed the girl's hand with his free one. "Hold on to your brother," he commanded. The boy gripped his sister's other hand, forming a chain. The smoke was thicker now, choking them. The little ones were coughing badly. Frank pulled his bandana from his neck and pressed it against the toddler's face. "Keep low and follow me." They stumbled through the inferno. The heat was unbearable, and Frank could hear the house groaning around them. The front door seemed miles away. His lungs screamed for clean air. Something crashed behind them. The little girl screamed. Frank didn't look back. Couldn't look back. He pushed forward, half dragging the children. Finally, mercifully, cool air hit his face. They burst through the doorway just as another section of roof collapsed. Frank's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees on the street, still clutching the children. The firefighters rushed forward, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Frank's chest heaved as he gulped in clean air. The toddler wouldn't let go of his neck, tiny fingers gripping his jacket like a lifeline. The older children pressed against him, trembling. They were alive. Somehow they were all alive. Through the crowd, Molly ran toward them, tears streaming down her face. Her relief was palpable as she saw her siblings safe. The firefighters moved in with oxygen masks and blankets, but the children stayed close to Frank, as if afraid he might disappear. Frank's head spun from smoke inhalation, but he remained upright, one arm around the toddler, the other steadying the older girl. The boy stood pressed against his side, still shaking but trying to look brave. The gathered crowd stared at the unlikely scene. A leather-clad Hell's Angel surrounded by clinging children, all of them covered in soot and smoke. The firefighters exchanged bewildered glances, clearly struggling to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Molly's sobs of relief filled the air as she hugged her siblings, her small hands reaching out to touch Frank's arm as if to reassure herself that he too was really there, really safe. The smoke still hung thick in the air as Frank sat on the curb, his leather jacket covered in soot. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. 3 pairs of small hands gripped his arms tightly, the children he'd just pulled from the flames refusing to let go. The youngest, barely 2 years old, had buried her face against his side, her tiny fingers clutching the worn leather of his jacket. The middle child, a boy of about 5, kept wiping his nose with his sleeve, his eyes wide and glassy. The oldest, around 9, sat quietly, occasionally glancing at Frank with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Frank's throat felt raw from the smoke, and his muscles ached from carrying the children to safety. He'd never felt more out of place in his life. The tattoos on his arms and the patches on his jacket marked him as someone to be feared, not trusted with children's lives. Yet here he was, surrounded by 3 traumatized kids who seemed to think he was their lifeline. Paramedics bustled around them, checking the children for injuries. One of them, a kind-faced woman, draped orange shock blankets over their shoulders. "You should let us check you too," she said to Frank, but he shook his head. He'd had worse. The fire truck's lights still flashed against the nearby houses, casting everything in alternating red and white. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering and pointing. Frank could hear fragments of their conversations, questions about where the mother was, Why a Hell's Angel was involved? What would happen to the kids? He didn't have answers to any of those questions. His mind kept returning to the little girl's words before he'd rushed into the building. "Your 3 children are in there." The phrase made no sense. He had no children, had never wanted any. Yet something about her desperate plea had moved him to action. A social worker appeared, clipboard in hand, asking questions Frank couldn't answer. Where was their mother? Did they have any relatives nearby? The children just huddled closer to him, as if afraid they'd be taken away. "Sir," the social worker started, "we'll need to—" But before she could finish, Molly pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, but her eyes were clear and determined. She walked straight up to Frank, ignoring the social worker's attempt to stop her. The 3 children immediately reached for her, and she hugged each one in turn, whispering soft words of comfort. Then she turned to Frank, her small face serious and wise beyond her years. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. "They needed someone to save them, and you did." Frank shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "I just did what anyone would have done," he muttered, but Molly shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone would have run into a burning building. Not anyone would have carried all 3 of them out." She looked at the 3 children, who were watching her with complete trust, then back at Frank. Taking a small step closer, she reached up and touched his sooty sleeve. Molly looked up at Frank and whispered, "You're their hero now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and responsibility. Frank stood there, rooted to the spot, as the full weight of what had just happened, and what those words might mean, settled over him like a heavy blanket. Frank sat in a hard plastic chair, his leather vest still smelling of smoke. The fire chief's office felt too small, too clean for someone like him. Charts and safety posters decorated the walls, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just witnessed. "Look," Fire Chief Roberts said, leaning forward on his desk. "Those kids have been through hell." He shuffled through some papers, his face grim. "Their mother, Sarah Thompson. We've had multiple calls to that house, usually cooking fires, sometimes worse." Frank's hands tightened into fists. The adrenaline from the rescue had worn off, leaving him with a hollow feeling in his gut. "Where is she now?" "Rehab. 3rd time this year." Roberts sighed, removing his reading glasses. "Pills, mostly. Started after her husband died 2 years ago. Car accident." He paused, studying Frank's face. "You really didn't know any of them before today?" "No." Frank's voice was rough. He could still feel Molly's small hand clutching his, her desperate words echoing in his mind. "The little girl, Molly, she just—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain what had happened. "Molly's the oldest. She's been taking care of her half-siblings since their mother started sliding." Roberts pulled out more papers. "Grace is 5. Tommy's 2. Different father than Molly, the one who passed away." Frank rubbed his face, feeling the grit of soot on his skin. "What happens to them now?" "Social services is working on emergency placement. Foster care, probably split up." "Split up?" Frank interrupted, surprising himself with the sharp edge in his voice. Roberts nodded slowly. "It's hard to place 3 kids together, especially with their history. Most foster homes can only take 1 or 2. The thought of those kids being separated made Frank's chest tight. He remembered how they'd clung to each other outside the burning house, how Molly had held her siblings' hands while the paramedics checked them over. "Their mother," Frank said. "How long until she's better?" "Could be months, could be never." Robert's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't her first relapse. Each time it gets harder for the system to give her another chance. Frank stood up suddenly, pacing the small office. His motorcycle boots made heavy sounds on the linoleum floor. He thought of his own life. The violence, the endless roads, the emptiness he'd been running from for years. He was the last person who should care about what happened to these kids. But Molly's words wouldn't leave him alone. "You're their hero now." "They're at the hospital?" he asked, stopping his pacing. "Just for observation. Smoke inhalation, minor burns. They'll be released to social services tomorrow morning." Roberts watched him carefully. "You did good today, getting them out. But now it's time to let the system handle it." Frank nodded, but something inside him rebelled at the thought. He remembered the terror in Grace's eyes, the way little Tommy had buried his face in his neck as he carried them out, the way Molly looked at him like he could fix everything. "Can I—" He cleared his throat. "Would it be okay if I checked on them at the hospital?" Robert studied him for a long moment. "You're welcome to visit. But don't make promises you can't keep. These kids have had enough disappointment." Frank felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders, heavy as his leather vest. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, hadn't wanted it. But now, knowing what waited for these children, separation, uncertainty, more loss, he felt something crack inside his carefully maintained walls. The rumble of Frank's Harley echoed through the empty streets as he left the fire station behind. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. His hands gripped the handlebars tighter than usual, his knuckles white beneath his leather gloves. The conversation with the fire chief kept playing in his mind like a broken record. 3 kids, he muttered to himself, the words nearly lost in the wind. What am I supposed to do with that? The image of their small faces, covered in soot but looking at him with such trust, wouldn't leave him. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the familiar comfort of his motorcycle's vibrations. But every time he blinked, he saw Molly's tear-stained face, heard her words. "You're their hero now." Frank pulled into Jimmy's Diner, a worn-down place on the edge of town where the neon sign flickered weakly in the growing darkness. As he cut the engine, he noticed a familiar bike already parked outside, Jake's custom Springer. His stomach tightened. The bell above the door jingled as Frank stepped inside. The smell of coffee and grease filled the air. A few truckers occupied the counter, but his eyes went straight to the corner booth where Jake sat, nursing a cup of coffee. "Well, well," Jake drawled, a crooked smile spreading across his face. "If it isn't the local hero." Frank slid into the booth across from him, his leather jacket creaking against the vinyl seats. "Don't start." The waitress approached, her pen poised over her notepad. "Just coffee," Frank said, not meeting her eyes. Jake leaned forward, his voice low. "Word travels fast in this town. Heard you went charging into a burning building today. That doesn't sound like the Frank I know." "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think," Frank replied, his jaw tightening. 3 kids, huh?" Jake's fingers drummed against his coffee cup. "Since when do you care about playing daddy?" Frank's coffee arrived, and he wrapped his hands around the hot mug, grateful for something to focus on besides Jake's probing stare. "I don't. Just did what anyone would do." "That's not what I heard." Jake's voice took on an edge. "Heard you've been asking questions about their situation, getting involved." "Drop it, Jake." "You really think you could handle being responsible for 3 kids?" Jake scoffed. "Come on, Frank. You remember Manila, that mess in '98? You're not exactly father material." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Manila, a memory he'd tried hard to bury. He stared into his coffee, watching the surface ripple from his slightly shaking hands. Those kids need someone stable, Jake continued, his voice softening with fake concern. Someone who doesn't have our kind of history. You really want to bring them into your world? Frank remained silent, but doubt began creeping in like a cold draft. He thought about the teddy bear tattoo on his forearm, covering up old gang symbols, about the nightmares that still woke him in cold sweats, about the way his hands sometimes shook when he thought about the past. Look, Jake said, standing up and dropping a few bills on the table. I'm just trying to be a friend here. Some people aren't cut out to be fathers. No shame in knowing your limitations. As Jake's boots clicked against the linoleum floor, Frank sat there, his coffee growing cold. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the kitchen, plates clattered. But all Frank could hear was Jake's words echoing in his head, mixing with memories he'd rather forget, and the desperate hope he'd seen in those children's eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Frank stepped into the shelter's common room. The place smelled of cleaning supplies and old carpet, making his nose twitch. His heavy boots seemed out of place on the worn linoleum floor, each step echoing through the quiet space. A social worker gave him a nervous smile from behind her desk. "The children are in the play area," she said, pointing toward a corner filled with well-worn toys. Frank nodded, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. He spotted the oldest child first, then the middle one, but little Grace was nowhere to be seen. His heart sank a bit when he noticed a small movement behind the faded yellow curtains near the window. "Grace," he called out softly, trying to make his gruff voice gentler. The curtain rustled slightly, and he could see tiny sock-covered toes peeking out from beneath the fabric. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair, wondering what to do. He'd faced down rival gang members without flinching, but this 2-year-old's fear made him feel completely lost. He walked closer to the window, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there, little one," he said, crouching down despite the protest from his still healing burns. "Remember me? From the fire?" The curtain moved again, and one big brown eye peered out at him. Frank stayed where he was, not wanting to frighten her more. He noticed a stuffed rabbit lying on the floor nearby and picked it up. "Look what I found here," he said, holding the toy gently in his rough hands. "This little guy looks lonely. Think he needs a friend?" Grace's tiny fingers appeared at the edge of the curtain, gripping it tightly. Frank waited patiently, remembering how his mother used to say that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is be still. "You know," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I might look scary in my big jacket and boots, but I promise I'm not so bad." He placed the rabbit on the windowsill, within her reach. "I'm just a guy who wants to make sure you're okay." A small face emerged from behind the curtain, eyes wide and questioning. Grace looked at the rabbit, then at Frank, then back at the rabbit. Her lower lip trembled slightly. "It's okay to be scared," Frank said, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. "But you don't have to be scared of me. I'm the one who carried you out of the fire, remember?" Grace took a tiny step forward, one hand still holding the curtain like a security blanket. Frank remained perfectly still as she reached for the stuffed rabbit with her free hand. "That's it," he encouraged. "Nice and easy." In one quick movement, Grace snatched the rabbit and hugged it to her chest. But instead of retreating behind the curtain again, she stayed where she was, studying Frank's face. Frank smiled, and something in his expression must have reassured her because she took another small step toward him. Her tiny hand reached out and touched the skull ring on his finger, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. "Shiny?" she whispered, the first word he'd heard her speak. "Yeah, it is shiny," Frank agreed, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Would you like to come sit with your brothers and sister? Maybe we could find some more toys for your rabbit friend?" Grace nodded, and to his amazement, she slipped her small hand into his large one. As they walked together toward the play area, Frank marveled at how natural it felt, this tiny hand trusting his rough one to guide her safely. Frank shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair of the rehab center's visiting room. The sterile white walls and antiseptic smell reminded him of hospitals, places he'd always avoided. Across from him sat Carla, Molly's mother, her thin frame drowning in an oversized sweater. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled as she wrapped them around a paper cup of coffee. "I keep seeing their faces," Carla whispered, her voice cracking. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them in that burning house." She took a shaky breath. "If you hadn't been there." Frank's jaw tightened. He'd seen plenty of broken people in his life, but something about Carla's vulnerability struck a chord. "They're safe now," he said gruffly. "That's what matters." Carla's eyes filled with tears. Molly's always been the strong one. Even when she was tiny, she looked after the others. No child should have to do that. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "I failed them. I know I failed them." Frank stayed silent, watching her hands shake around the cup. He thought of Molly's brave face, of Grace's shy smile, of the way the children huddled together like they were all they had in the world. "The doctors say I need at least 6 more months here," Carla continued. "Maybe longer. I have to get clean this time, really clean." She looked up at Frank, her eyes desperate. "But the kids, they need someone now." "They've got the shelter staff," Frank said. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't enough. The temporary shelter was just that. Temporary. "They trust you," Carla said softly. "Molly talks about you every time I call. She says you're gentle with Grace, that you make them feel safe." Her voice broke. "Please, Frank. I know I have no right to ask, but could you look after them? Just until I'm better?" Frank's heart hammered in his chest. He thought of his small apartment above the auto shop, of his rough lifestyle, of the dangerous people he'd known. "I'm not exactly father material," he muttered. "You ran into a burning building for them," Carla countered. "You didn't even know them, but you risked your life." She reached across the table, her thin fingers touching his weathered hand. "They need someone like that. Someone brave enough to step up when it matters." Frank pulled his hand back, running it through his graying hair. The weight of what she was asking settled on his shoulders like a heavy chain. He thought of his past, of the things he'd done with the motorcycle gang, of all the reasons he'd never thought he'd be responsible for anyone but himself. "I'm begging you," Carla whispered. "I promise I'll get better. I'll do everything the doctors say. Just please, please take care of my babies until I can come back to them." Frank had heard promises like this before, from addicts, from people who meant well but couldn't follow through. He looked at Carla's pleading face and saw both sincerity and weakness there. The children's faces flashed through his mind. Molly's determined expression, Grace's tentative trust, the way they all looked at him like he could somehow make everything okay. "I don't know if I'm the right man for this," he said quietly, the doubt heavy in his voice. Carla's broken promises hung in the air between them, and Frank wondered if he was about to make a promise he couldn't keep himself. Frank's heavy boots crunched on the gravel pathway as he led the 3 children toward the playground. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. He felt out of place, a tattooed hell's angel among soccer moms and nannies who cast wary glances his way. "Can I go on the swings?" Molly asked, tugging at his leather jacket. Her eyes sparkled with hope, a stark contrast to the tears he'd seen in them just days ago at the fire. "Sure, kid," Frank nodded, his gruff voice softening. "Just be careful." "Grace, the youngest at 2, clung to his leg while 5-year-old Tommy bounced from foot to foot, eager to join his sister. Frank scooped Grace up, surprised at how natural it felt to hold her tiny frame against his chest. "Uncle Frank?" Tommy pulled at his jeans. "Will you push me on the swings too?" The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Uncle Frank. He'd never been anyone's uncle before, never been trusted with something so precious as a child's faith. His throat tightened as he watched Tommy's expectant face. "Yeah, buddy, let's go." He carried Grace to the swings, where Molly was already pumping her legs, gaining height with each swing. Other parents moved their children away as Frank approached, but he barely noticed. His focus was on Tommy, scrambling onto the swing seat, and Grace, who refused to let go of his neck. "Higher," Tommy squealed as Frank pushed him gently. "I want to touch the sky." Frank couldn't help but smile, a rare expression that felt foreign on his weathered face. He remembered his own childhood, how no one had ever taken him to the park, how he'd learned early that the world was a harsh place with no room for childhood dreams. Grace finally loosened her grip enough to sit in the toddler swing, her small hands gripping the safety bar. Frank pushed her too, alternating between her and Tommy, while Molly showed off her independence. "Watch me, Uncle Frank," Molly called out, pumping higher and higher. The title kept catching him off guard. Uncle Frank. Not just Frank the biker, Frank the tough guy. Frank the man everyone feared. Here, he was something else entirely. As the afternoon wore on, the kids tired themselves out. They sat together on a park bench, sharing the snacks Frank had thought to bring, something he'd never imagined himself doing. Tommy leaned against his arm, chocolate smeared on his face. Grace dozed in his lap, her small fingers curled around his thumb. Molly sat cross-legged on the ground in front of them, telling an animated story about her day at school. Looking at these 3 kids who trusted him, who looked to him for protection and comfort, Frank felt something shift inside him. The familiar weight of his gang affiliations, the tough guy persona he'd worn like armor for so long, seemed less important now. "Uncle Frank?" Molly's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can we come back tomorrow?" He looked at their hopeful faces, these children who had somehow crashed into his life and turned everything upside down. For the first time since he could remember, Frank felt like he might have found something worth living for beyond the brotherhood of his motorcycle gang. "Yeah," he said softly, adjusting Grace in his arms. "We can come back tomorrow." The bell above the diner's door chimed as Frank held it open, watching the kids file in one by one. The warm smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air. Little Grace clutched his leather jacket, while Tommy, the middle child, bounced ahead to claim their favorite booth. Sarah, the oldest, helped Molly slide into the red vinyl seat. "Easy there, Tommy," Frank said, his gruff voice softer than usual. "The booth ain't going nowhere." The waitress, Betty, approached with a warm smile and 5 menus. She'd gotten used to seeing them over the past few weeks, this odd little group that showed up for dinner most Thursdays. "The usual chocolate milk for the little ones?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Frank nodded, settling into his seat. "And coffee for me, Black." Grace sat close to Frank, her small shoulder pressed against his arm. She was still the quietest of the bunch, but she'd stopped hiding behind curtains, at least. These days, she preferred hiding behind Frank instead. "Can I get pancakes?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Please, Uncle Frank." The title still caught Frank off guard sometimes, making his chest tight in a way he couldn't quite explain. He cleared his throat. "It's dinner time, bud. How about a burger instead?" "With extra pickles?" Tommy bargained, grinning. "Sure thing, kid." Sarah helped Molly read the menu, pointing out words the younger girl didn't know. Frank watched them, amazed at how they'd formed their own little system. Sarah had stepped up as the big sister, looking out for the others in ways that made his heart ache. Betty returned with their drinks, setting down 4 chocolate milks with perfect precision. "You folks ready to order?" As they called out their choices, burger for Tommy, grilled cheese for Grace, chicken fingers for Molly, and a salad for Sarah, who was trying to eat healthy. Frank felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. This simple moment, ordering dinner with 4 kids who trusted him to take care of them, felt more real than anything in his past life. The food arrived, and the table fell into an easy rhythm. Frank cut Grace's grilled cheese into triangles, just the way she liked it. Tommy told jokes that made no sense, but they all laughed anyway. Even Sarah relaxed enough to steal some of Frank's fries, giving him a mischievous grin when he pretended not to notice. "Uncle Frank," Molly piped up, "can you tell us the story about the time you fixed that really old motorcycle?" "Again?" Frank chuckled, but he couldn't help smiling. "You've heard that one 3 times already." "Please?" Grace's soft voice joined in, and Frank knew he was done for. As he launched into the familiar tale, embellishing the parts he knew made them laugh. Betty passed by their table. She paused, coffee pot in hand, watching them with a gentle expression. "You know," she said, topping off Frank's cup, "you all make such a sweet family. It does my heart good to see you in here." Frank's words caught in his throat. The kids beamed at Betty's comment, but Frank felt his chest tighten. Family. The word echoed in his mind, bringing with it a rush of joy he hadn't expected. And right behind it, a wave of doubt that made his hands shake slightly as he reached for his coffee. He looked at the kids' faces, bright with trust and affection, and realized with a start that he cared about them more than he'd ever meant to, more than he thought possible. The thought terrified him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the open garage door as Frank wiped grease from his hands. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal hung in the air. He'd been fixing up an old Harley, trying to keep his mind off the growing complications in his life. The rumble of a motorcycle engine made him look up. His stomach tightened as he recognized the sound. A custom chopper he knew all too well. Jake's bike rolled into view, its chrome gleaming menacingly in the sunlight. Frank tossed his rag aside and straightened up, his jaw clenching. Jake killed the engine and dismounted, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. A twisted smile played across his face. "Well, well," Jake said, walking into the garage like he owned it. "Look what's become of the mighty Frank." His eyes swept over the modest workspace. "Trading in your colors for a wrench and some kids' drawings?" He gestured to the crayon artwork taped to the wall, pictures the children had made for Frank. "What do you want, Jake?" Frank's voice was low, controlled, but his hands had balled into fists at his sides. Jake circled the garage, running his finger along a toolbox. "Word travels fast in our circles, brother. Heard you've gone soft, playing daddy to some junkies' kids?" He clicked his tongue. "That ain't the Frank I know. The Frank you knew is gone." Frank moved between Jake and the children's drawings, a protective instinct he couldn't explain. Jake laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Gone? You really think you can just walk away?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You've got blood on your hands, same as me. You think these kids would look at you the same if they knew what you've done?" The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, dark memories he'd been trying to bury. "That life is behind me," Frank said, but Jake was already shaking his head. "You don't get to decide that," Jake sneered. "You made promises, took oaths. The club doesn't forget, and neither do our enemies." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. How long before one of them finds out about your little family? Frank's chest tightened. He'd been trying not to think about this very thing, how his past could endanger the children. Those kids deserve better than you, Jake continued, his words dripping with venom. You're fooling yourself if you think you can play house and pretend you're normal. The things we've done. He tapped his temple. They don't wash away. Frank gripped the edge of his workbench, his knuckles white. Every word Jake spoke voiced the doubts that had been haunting him since the day of the fire. You can't escape who you are, Frank, Jake said, backing toward his bike. The life we lived, it's in your blood. Those kids? They're just a fantasy, and sooner or later reality's gonna come knocking. Jake kicked his bike to life, the engine roaring in the confined space. Think about it, brother. You can't run from who you really are. As Jake's bike disappeared down the street, Frank stood in his garage, surrounded by tools and children's drawings. The life he'd been building felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse. Jake's words echoed in his head, and for the first time since taking in the children, Frank felt truly torn between two worlds, the darkness of his past and the light he'd found in those kids' eyes. Frank sat in the stark waiting room of Child Protective Services, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted uncomfortably in the too small plastic chair. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal. 3 chairs down, Molly dozed against her older sister Sarah's shoulder, while little Grace played quietly with a worn teddy bear on the floor. Ms. Patterson, their social worker, emerged from her office with a grim expression. "Mr. Henderson, could you step in here for a moment?" Frank's stomach clenched. He'd been dreading this conversation all morning. Following her into the cramped office, he lowered himself into another uncomfortable chair. "The Wilsons have withdrawn their foster care application," Ms. Patterson said, cutting straight to the point. "Mrs. Wilson's mother had a stroke, and they need to focus on her care." Frank ran a calloused hand over his face. "So what happens to the kids now?" "That's what we need to discuss." She shuffled through some papers on her desk. "Our options are limited. The group home in Cedar Rapids has space, but they'd have to be separated by age groups." "Separated?" Frank's voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "They've been through enough already." Ms. Patterson nodded sympathetically. "I agree, but unless we can find another foster family willing to take all 3 children..." She left the sentence hanging. Through the office window, Frank could see Grace showing her teddy bear to Molly, who was now awake and smiling tiredly at her little sister. Sarah sat watching them both, her thin shoulders carrying more responsibility than any 9-year-old should have to bear. "What about me?" The words tumbled out before Frank could stop them. Ms. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. "You want to apply for foster care?" Frank shifted in his seat, his leather jacket suddenly feeling too heavy, too much like armor he shouldn't be wearing. "I've been spending time with them. They trust me." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "And I can't let them be split up." "Mr. Henderson, becoming a foster parent is a serious commitment. There would be background checks, home studies, training requirements." "I know it ain't gonna be easy," Frank interrupted, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. "But these kids need someone now, not 3 months from now when some perfect family might show up." Miss Patterson studied him for a long moment. "Your history with the motorcycle gang would come up in the background check." "I ain't been active in 5 years, Frank said quietly. "Got the paperwork to prove it." She leaned back in her chair, considering. "You'd need to make significant changes. Your living situation, your work schedule, your lifestyle. Everything would need to accommodate 3 children." Frank looked out at the kids again. Grace had crawled into Molly's lap now, both of them leafing through a picture book. Sarah caught his eye through the window and gave him a small, hopeful smile. "Where do I sign?" Frank asked, turning back to Ms. Patterson. She pulled out a thick stack of forms. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Henderson. Are you absolutely sure about this?" Frank stared at the paperwork, his heart pounding. He thought about his small apartment above the garage, his irregular work hours, his solitary life. Everything would have to change. The weight of what he was considering pressed down on him like a physical force. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't qualified. He wasn't the kind of man who should be raising 3 kids. But he was all they had. With trembling fingers that had never hesitated to work on engines or throw a punch, Frank reached for the papers. Frank sat in Ms. Peterson's office at Child Services, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted uncomfortably in the small chair. The social worker's desk was covered with papers, and her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. "The Hendersons are a wonderful family," she explained, sliding photos across the desk. "They have a beautiful home in the suburbs, plenty of space, and experience fostering children." Frank picked up one of the pictures. A smiling couple stood in front of a 2-story house with a well-kept lawn. Everything about them screamed stability, something he couldn't offer. "They've already been approved," Ms. Peterson continued. "They could take all 3 children tomorrow." The kids sat in the waiting room outside. Through the window, Frank could see Molly reading a book to Grace, while Tommy, the middle child, played with some toys on the floor. His chest tightened at the sight. "Would you like to meet them?" Ms. Peterson asked. Before Frank could answer, there was a knock at the door. The Hendersons walked in, dressed in neat, casual clothes that made Frank's worn jeans and motorcycle boots seem even more out of place. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. "We've heard so much about the children," she said. "We have a bedroom ready for the girls to share, and Tommy would have his own space." Frank nodded silently, his throat tight. Everything about them was perfect, exactly what the kids needed. So why did it feel so wrong? "Would you like to introduce us to them?" Mr. Henderson asked. Frank stood up and walked to the waiting room. As soon as he opened the door, 3 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Grace immediately ran to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his leg. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, picking her up. "There are some nice people who want to meet you." Molly's face fell. "Are they taking us away?" The tremor in her voice made Frank's heart ache. Tommy dropped his toy car and moved closer to Frank, pressing against his side. "They're good people," Frank explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "They have a nice house with rooms for all of you." "But we want to stay with you," Tommy whispered. Grace buried her face in Frank's neck, her small body shaking. Molly stood up, her chin quivering but defiant. "You promised you wouldn't leave us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank looked at the 3 children clinging to him, then at the Hendersons watching from the office doorway. They were everything he wasn't. Stable, prepared, proper. They could give the kids everything he couldn't, but as he held Grace closer, feeling Tommy's grip on his jacket and seeing the trust in Molly's eyes, something shifted inside him. These kids had already lost so much. They'd been abandoned, shuffled around, and now they were facing another change. The Hendersons might be the logical choice, but logic didn't account for the bond that had formed between him and these children. It didn't measure the way Grace's nightmares only stopped when he was near, or how Tommy's stutter disappeared when they worked on his motorcycle together, or how Molly's eyes lit up when he promised to teach her to ride a bike. Looking down at their worried faces, Frank made his decision. It terrified him. He had no idea how to be a parent, and his past could complicate everything. But these kids needed him, and somehow, along the way, he had started needing them too. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garage's parking lot as Frank wiped grease from his hands. He heard the familiar rumble of a motorcycle before he saw it. Jake's black Harley rolled into view, its chrome pipes gleaming. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. The kids were safely at school, and he intended to keep it that way. Jake killed the engine and swung off his bike with practiced ease. His leather vest bore the patches of their old life, a reminder of everything Frank was trying to leave behind. "You're looking domestic these days, Frank," Jake said, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "Never thought I'd see you playing house?" Frank dropped his rag into a nearby bucket. "What do you want, Jake?" "Just checking on an old friend." Jake's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached. "Word is you're taking in those kids for good. That true?" "That's none of your business." Jake's face hardened. "Everything about you is my business. You forget who you are? What you've done?" "I haven't forgotten anything," Frank said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "But that life's behind me now." "Behind you?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't just walk away. The club won't let you." Frank stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I already did, and I'm not coming back." "Those kids don't know who you really are," Jake spat. "What happens when they find out? When they learn about the things you've done?" "Leave them out of this." Frank's hands clenched into fists. Jake noticed and smiled. "There he is. There's the Frank I know. All that violence just under the surface. You think you can hide that from them?" "I'm not hiding anything. I'm changing." Frank's voice was firm. "And if you or anyone else tries to mess with those kids, you'll what?" Jake stepped closer, his face inches from Frank's. "Go back to your old ways? Prove my point?" The tension crackled between them. Frank could feel his old instincts screaming at him to strike first, to handle this the way he would have in the past. But Molly's face flashed in his mind, her trust in him absolute. "No," Frank said quietly. "I won't, because that's not who I am anymore." Jake's expression flickered with surprise at the calm in Frank's voice. "Those kids need me," Frank continued, "and I need them. If you can't understand that, fine, but stay away from us." "You're weak," Jake sneered, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "The club won't forget this betrayal." "I don't care what the club thinks anymore." Frank stood his ground. "I found something worth protecting, something real." They stared at each other for a long moment, years of shared history and violence hanging between them. Finally, Jake took a step back. "You're making a mistake," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "The only mistake was waiting this long to leave." Jake's jaw worked as he processed Frank's words. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the smell of burning rubber behind. Frank watched him go, his heart pounding. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort it had taken to hold back. He leaned against his toolbox, letting out a long breath. The confrontation had left him rattled, but he knew he'd made the right choice. The old Frank would have solved this with his fists, but he wasn't that man anymore. He couldn't be, not if he wanted to be worthy of the trust those kids had placed in him. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Frank stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. It wasn't anything fancy, just the boxed mix kind, but the kids' faces lit up at the smell of breakfast. Grace sat in her booster seat, carefully arranging her stuffed animals around her plate. "Uncle Frank," Molly called from the living room, "can you help me with my bike after school? The chain keeps falling off." Frank nodded, sliding a perfectly golden pancake onto her waiting plate. "Sure thing, kiddo. We'll fix it up good as new." The past few weeks had settled into a rhythm he never expected. School drop-offs, homework help, and weekend trips to the park had become his new normal. The leather jacket he'd worn proudly as a Hell's Angel now hung in the closet more often than not, replaced by a worn denim one that was better suited for pushing swings and teaching wobbly bike rides. That afternoon, Frank sat cross-legged on the driveway, showing Molly how to oil her bike chain. Her dark hair fell in her face as she leaned in close, watching his every move with intense concentration. "See? Just like that," he demonstrated, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. "You want to keep it clean and smooth?" Later that week, Frank found himself sitting in a tiny chair at the elementary school's parent-teacher conference. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, smiled warmly as she showed him Molly's latest art project, a family drawing with Frank right in the center, surrounded by all three kids. "She's really flourishing," Mrs. Thompson said. "The stability has made such a difference." Frank's throat tightened as he looked at the crayon drawing. He'd never thought of himself as anyone's family before. At home, he spent hours teaching the middle child, Tommy, how to throw a baseball. The boy's coordination wasn't great, but his determination made Frank proud. They practiced until the sun started to set, Tommy's throws getting just a little better each time. But it was Grace who surprised him the most. The tiny 2-year-old who had once hidden from him now followed him everywhere, her small hand often finding its way into his as they walked through the grocery store or down the sidewalk. Her trust in him grew slowly, like a flower opening its petals to the sun. One evening, as the sky turned purple with twilight, Frank sat on the front porch steps. Grace toddled out to join him, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Without a word, she climbed into his lap, her head resting against his chest as they looked up at the emerging stars. "Star," she whispered, pointing up with a tiny finger. "That's right, sweetheart," Frank replied softly, his voice gruff with emotion. "Those are stars." They sat there together, this unlikely pair, the former Hell's Angel and the little girl who had somehow worked her way into his heart. Grace's breathing became slow and steady as she drifted to sleep in his arms, completely trusting, completely at peace. Frank looked down at her peaceful face, then back up at the star-filled sky. In all his years of riding with the gang, searching for freedom on endless highways, he'd never felt as free as he did right now, holding this sleeping child and knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Frank sat at his kitchen table, staring at his coffee mug, the phone still warm in his hand. Miss Thompson, the social worker, had just delivered the news he'd been dreading. Carla had relapsed. She'd left the rehab center without completing her program, and no one knew where she was. He rubbed his weathered face, his calloused hands rough against his skin. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The kids were in the living room, watching cartoons and eating breakfast. Their laughter drifted into the kitchen, innocent and carefree. "Uncle Frank?" Molly's small voice made him look up. She stood in the doorway, still in her pink pajamas with little hearts on them. "Why do you look sad?" Frank cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "Come here, kiddo." He patted the chair next to him. Molly climbed onto the chair, her big brown eyes fixed on his face. She had always been able to read him like a book, this wise little soul in a child's body. "Miss Thompson called," he said softly. "Your mom, she's having a tough time again." Molly's face fell, her small shoulders slumping. "She left the helping place, didn't she?" Frank nodded, his heart aching at how quickly Molly understood. "Yeah, she did. What's going to happen to us?" Her voice trembled. "Miss Thompson says they need to figure some things out. Make sure you kids are somewhere safe and stable." Molly's eyes filled with tears. "But we're safe here. With you." Her voice rose, catching the attention of her siblings in the other room. Grace and Tommy wandered into the kitchen, sensing something was wrong. Grace, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, climbed into Frank's lap without hesitation. Tommy stood nearby, his cereal forgotten. "Please don't let them take us away," Molly pleaded, grabbing Frank's arm. Her tears were falling freely now. "We want to stay with you. You're our family now." Frank's throat tightened. These kids had wormed their way into his heart, past all his defenses. The thought of them being taken away made his chest hurt in a way he'd never experienced before. "Uncle Frank?" Grace's tiny voice piped up. "Don't you want us anymore?" "Of course I want you," Frank said roughly, his arms tightening around Grace. "That's not the question, sweetheart." "Then what is?" Tommy asked, his young face serious. Frank looked at each of their faces, Grace's innocent trust, Tommy's quiet worry, and Molly's desperate hope. These kids needed stability, safety, a proper home. Could he really provide that? Him with his checkered past and his connection to the motorcycle gang? "Please," Molly whispered, her grip on his arm tightening. "We love you. Don't let them take us away." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Love. These kids loved him, despite everything. Despite his rough exterior, his past mistakes, his uncertainties. They saw something in him he wasn't sure he saw in himself. "Uncle Frank?" Molly's voice cracked with fear. Frank looked at their tear-stained faces, feeling torn between what he thought was right and what his heart was telling him. These kids had already been through so much. Could he really let them go through more upheaval? But what could he, an ex-gang member with no experience as a father, really offer them? Molly buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. "Don't give up on us," she begged. "Please don't give up on us." Frank paced back and forth in his small living room, his heavy boots wearing a path in the carpet. The kids were asleep upstairs, but their earlier tears and Molly's desperate pleas echoed in his mind. He ran his calloused hands through his graying hair, his heart pounding with a different kind of fear than he'd ever known in his gang days. The social worker's words about Carla's relapse played on repeat in his head. He'd seen it coming. The way she'd missed their scheduled calls with the kids, the hollow promises, the familiar signs of someone sliding back into old habits. But now, facing the reality of what it meant for the children, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. He stopped at the window, staring out at his motorcycle gleaming under the streetlight. That bike used to represent freedom, the ability to just ride away when things got tough. But now, the thought of leaving made him sick to his stomach. These kids needed him, not just as Uncle Frank or a temporary guardian, but as something more permanent. The next morning, Frank gathered the children in the kitchen. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on their worried faces. Grace clutched her stuffed rabbit, while the others sat quietly, fear evident in their eyes. They'd been through this before, adults making decisions about their lives, moving them from place to place. "I need to tell you something important," Frank said, his voice gentler than it had ever been in his old life. He cleared his throat, fighting past the emotion threatening to choke him. "Your mama, she's having a hard time again." Molly's face fell, but she nodded, old beyond her years. "Is she sick again?" "Yes, sweetheart, she is." Frank knelt down to their level, something he'd learned to do over these past months. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I've been thinking about all of us." The children leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Frank took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. "I want to adopt you, all of you. Make it official. Make us a real family." The words came out in a rush, his heart hammering against his ribs. If that's what you want, of course. I know I'm not perfect, and I've got a past that... He didn't get to finish. Molly launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him over. The others followed, creating a tangle of small arms and tearful smiles. Grace's rabbit got squished between them, but she didn't seem to mind. "Really?" Molly asked, her eyes shining with hope. "You want to be our real dad?" "Yeah, kiddo, I do." Frank's voice cracked, but he didn't try to hide it. More than anything. The kitchen erupted in cheers and laughter. Molly's smile lit up her whole face, brighter than he'd ever seen it. The younger ones jumped up and down, their earlier fear forgotten in the joy of the moment. Frank felt something warm and unfamiliar expand in his chest. Pure, unconditional love for these children who had somehow become his whole world. For the first time since he'd pulled them from that burning house, Frank felt completely certain about his path forward. He wasn't just their temporary guardian or their rescuer anymore. He was their father, and he would move heaven and earth to keep them safe and happy. Frank sat on the worn leather couch in his small living room, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. His thoughts were a storm of doubt and fear, memories of his past life with the Hell's Angels mixing with images of the children's hopeful faces. "What kind of father could I possibly be?" he muttered to himself, running a calloused hand through his graying hair. The weight of his decision to adopt the children pressed heavily on his chest. Every mistake he'd ever made seemed to flash before his eyes. The fights, the deals gone wrong, the people he'd hurt. The leather patches from his old jacket lay crumpled in the corner, a reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. Frank's shoulders tensed as he remembered Jake's warning words about never truly escaping the past. His stomach churned with anxiety. He stood up and paced the floor, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak. The children were in their rooms, probably doing homework or playing quietly. The simple domesticity of it all felt foreign to him, like wearing someone else's clothes. "They deserve better," he whispered, stopping to stare at a crayon drawing Grace had made, stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands, their little family. His throat tightened at the sight. The sound of small footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. Her big brown eyes studied him with that quiet intensity that always seemed to see right through his tough exterior. Behind her, Molly appeared, concern written across her young face. "Are you okay, Frank?" she asked, taking a tentative step forward. Before he could answer, Grace padded across the room in her pink socks. Without a word, she reached up and took his large, rough hand in her tiny, soft one. The simple gesture of trust and love hit him like a physical force, making his eyes sting with unexpected tears. "We're family now," Grace said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was one of the longest sentences she'd spoken since the fire, and the words carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. Molly moved closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Nothing can change that," she added firmly, with all the certainty that only a child could possess. Frank felt the walls he'd built around his heart crumbling. These children, who had every reason to be afraid, to be untrusting, had chosen him. Despite his past, despite his mistakes, they saw something in him that he struggled to see in himself. Grace squeezed his hand tighter, looking up at him with complete trust in her eyes. In that moment, Frank realized that perhaps it wasn't about being the perfect father. Maybe it was about being there, about trying his best, about loving them with everything he had. The storm of doubt in his mind began to quiet. replaced by something stronger. The unwavering love of these children who had somehow become his whole world. They stood there together, a former Hell's Angel and two little girls, forming a picture of family that nobody could have predicted, but that felt more real than anything Frank had ever known. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank's garage as he worked beneath the hood of an old Chevy. His hands were steady, but his mind wandered to the kids at school. Grace had drawn him a picture that morning, stick figures of their family holding hands. It now hung proudly on his office wall. The rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through his thoughts. Frank's muscles tensed as he recognized the sound. A Harley-Davidson, modified with straight pipes. Jake's bike. "Still playing house, Frank?" Jake's voice carried across the empty garage. He stood in the doorway, leather vest gleaming with patches that reminded Frank of his old life. Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "What do you want, Jake?" "The boys are wondering why you've gone soft." Jake moved closer, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Living the American dream with someone else's broken family? It's not you, Frank. You don't know me anymore." Frank's voice was quiet but firm. He thought of Molly's trust, Grace's shy smiles, and the way the kids looked at him like he hung the moon. Jake's laugh was harsh. "Don't I? Remember Sacramento? That night at the warehouse? You were different then. A real brother? That was another life." Frank turned to face Jake fully. "I'm not that man anymore." "No?" Jake's hand slipped inside his vest. "Maybe we need to remind you who you really are. Would be a shame if those kids found out about their hero's past, or if something happened to their new home." Frank moved faster than Jake expected, closing the distance between them in 2 steps. His hand clamped down on Jake's wrist before it could withdraw whatever he was reaching for. "Listen carefully." Frank's voice was low, dangerous. "Those kids? They're off limits. My past? That's between you and me." Jake struggled against Frank's grip, but years of working on engines had made Frank's hands like steel. "You can't erase what you did," Jake spat. "No," Frank agreed. "I can't. But I can be better. For them." He released Jake's wrist with a slight push. "Walk away, Jake. There's nothing left for you here." Jake stumbled back, rubbing his wrist. His eyes darted around the garage, taking in the children's drawings on the wall, the family photo on Frank's desk. For a moment, something like envy crossed his face. "You really have changed," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of defeat. "Yeah, I have." Frank stood his ground, shoulders straight. "And if you ever come near my family again, you'll see exactly how much stronger that change has made me." Jake backed toward his bike, his swagger gone. He paused before mounting up, looking at Frank one last time. "The old crew won't understand. They don't have to." Frank watched as Jake kicked his bike to life. The roar of the engine filled the garage, then faded as Jake rode away, becoming nothing more than a distant echo of Frank's past. Frank stood in the doorway long after Jake disappeared, feeling the weight of his old life lifting from his shoulders. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the school playground a block away. Soon, his kids would be home, filling his life with their stories and dreams. His past would always be there, like a scar that never fully fades, but it no longer had the power to define him. He turned back to the Chevy, picking up his wrench. He had work to finish before picking up the kids from school. Real work, honest work, the kind that let him look his children in the eyes without shame. Frank straightened his tie for the 10th time, his rough hands trembling slightly. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. He'd traded his leather jacket for a pressed suit that felt stiff and foreign against his skin. "You look handsome," Molly said, reaching for his hand. She wore a pretty blue dress, her hair tied back with matching ribbons. Behind her, Grace and Tommy fidgeted in their Sunday best, their faces a mix of excitement and worry. Frank swallowed hard. He'd faced down rival gangs without flinching. But this made his heart race like nothing else. "Ready, kids?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Inside the courthouse, their footsteps echoed off the polished floors. Their social worker, Ms. Martinez, waited by the courtroom doors, clipboard in hand. She'd been skeptical of Frank at first, but over the months, she'd seen how he'd changed, how the children had changed him. "Everything's in order," she assured him with a warm smile. The home study was excellent, and the character references were very strong. Frank nodded, remembering how the local shopkeepers, teachers, and even the fire chief had vouched for him. The same community that had once eyed him with suspicion now supported him completely. The courtroom felt vast and intimidating. Frank guided the children to their seats, his hand steady on Grace's shoulder as she clung to her favorite stuffed rabbit. Tommy sat tall, trying to look grown up in his clip-on tie, while Molly kept sneaking glances at Frank, as if making sure he wasn't going to disappear. When the judge entered, Frank's throat went dry. This was it, the moment that would make them officially a family. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, looked over his glasses at the unusual group before him. "Mr. Francis Murphy," the judge began, using Frank's full name. "I've reviewed your petition for adoption thoroughly. I must say your case is unique." Frank's heart sank, but he stood straighter. He'd fight for these kids if he had to. "However," the judge continued, a smile warming his face, "I've rarely seen such compelling evidence of genuine love and commitment. The reports from the social workers, the school, and the community all paint a picture of a man who has completely transformed his life for these children." Grace reached for Frank's hand, and he squeezed it gently. Molly pressed against his other side, while Tommy stood proud and tall beside his sisters. The judge asked them to step forward. "Children, do you understand what's happening today?" "Yes, sir," Molly spoke up. "Frank's going to be our dad for real now. He already is in our hearts, but today it's going to be official." Frank blinked hard, fighting back tears he hadn't expected. The judge nodded, clearly touched by Molly's words. "Mr. Murphy, do you understand the responsibilities you're taking on? These children will be yours in every legal and moral sense." "Yes, Your Honor." Frank's voice was firm despite his emotions. "They already are." The judge picked up his pen, looking at the family before him, the tough former biker in his carefully pressed suit, the 3 children who looked at him with such trust and love. With a warm smile, he began signing the papers that would make them officially a family. Frank felt the weight of the moment settle over him as the judge's pen moved across the page. Each stroke brought them closer to what they already knew in their hearts. They belonged together. Snowflakes drifted past the window of Frank's small house as he watched Molly carefully unwrap an old box of Christmas ornaments. The worn cardboard container had been tucked away in his garage for years, forgotten until now. Inside were decorations from his own childhood, things he never thought he'd use again. "Look at this one." Molly held up a faded glass ball with careful hands. "It's so pretty, even though it's old." Grace, the youngest, sat cross-legged on the floor, methodically sorting through a pile of tinsel. Her small fingers worked with careful dedication, untangling each strand. The middle child, Tommy, was perched on a stepladder, trying to reach the higher branches of their modest pine tree. "Careful up there, buddy," Frank said, his voice gentler than he ever thought possible. He kept one hand steady on the ladder, ready to catch Tommy if he wobbled. "I want to put the star on top," Grace announced, abandoning her tinsel project. "We saved that for last," Frank explained, remembering how his own mother had always insisted on this tradition. It's special that way. The living room was warm and cozy, nothing like the cold emptiness it had been just months ago. Frank had spent weeks fixing it up, making it suitable for children. The walls, once bare, now displayed artwork from school and family photos. A bookshelf held children's stories instead of old motorcycle magazines. "Tell us about when you were little," Molly requested, hanging another ornament. "Did you have Christmas trees too?" Frank paused, caught off guard by the simple question. "Yeah, we did. My mom loved Christmas. She'd bake cookies all day long, and the whole house would smell like sugar and cinnamon." "Can we bake cookies?" Tommy asked, climbing down the ladder to grab more decorations. "Sure can. I might even remember her recipe." Frank smiled, surprised at how easily the happy memories came back. "She used to let me lick the spoon when she was done mixing." The children worked together, passing ornaments and sharing stories of their own. Some were sad, memories of previous Christmases that hadn't been so happy, but they mixed with new joy, creating something beautiful and healing. "Uncle Frank," Grace said, tugging at his sleeve, "can you lift me up to put this one higher?" She held a handmade ornament, a paper angel she'd crafted at school. Frank's heart squeezed at the trust in her eyes. He lifted her carefully, his strong arms gentle as he helped her reach the perfect spot. Grace's face glowed with pride as she placed her angel just where she wanted it. As the afternoon went on, the tree slowly transformed. What started as a simple pine became something magical, draped in lights, tinsel, and memories both old and new. When they finished, Frank pulled out a box of hot chocolate mix and marshmallows. "Last thing," he announced, reaching for the star. "Who wants to do the honors?" All three children raised their hands, but it was Molly who spoke up. "We should all do it together. We're a family now." Frank's throat tightened with emotion. He gathered all three children close, and together they placed the star on top of the tree. The lights twinkled, casting warm shadows across their faces as they stepped back to admire their work. "It's perfect," Tommy whispered. "Sure is, buddy," Frank agreed, his voice rough with feeling. "Sure is." The children gathered around him on the worn couch, their small bodies fitting perfectly against his sides. Grace curled up under his arm, while Tommy and Molly snuggled close. Frank reached for the remote, ready to start their Christmas movie marathon. Frank wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked around the transformed garage. What had once been a dingy space filled with old motorcycle parts was now something entirely different. The concrete floor gleamed with fresh sealant, and bright LED lights hung from the ceiling, chasing away the shadows that used to lurk in the corners. He'd spent weeks working on it, installing proper insulation in the walls and putting up fresh drywall. The kids had helped paint, leaving tiny handprints in places they thought he wouldn't notice. But he had noticed, and he'd left them there, each colorful mark a reminder of how far they'd come. In one corner, he'd built a homework station with a sturdy table and comfortable chairs. Molly needed a quiet place to study, away from her younger siblings' constant activity. Next to it stood a bookshelf he'd made himself, already half filled with children's books and school supplies. The other side of the garage had become a play area with soft foam mats covering the floor. Bright storage bins lined the walls, ready to contain the inevitable mess of toys that would soon fill them. He'd even installed a small TV and gaming console, though he'd been firm about homework coming first. His tools still had their place, organized neatly in red metal cabinets along the back wall. He'd child-proofed everything, making sure there was nothing dangerous within reach of curious hands. The smell of oil and grease that had once dominated the space was now just a faint undertone, beneath the scent of fresh paint and new carpet. Frank ran his hand along the smooth surface of the workbench he'd refinished. This was where he'd teach them about engines and mechanics when they were older, just as his own father had taught him. The thought brought an unexpected lump to his throat. Here, in this garage, he could pass on the good parts of his past while leaving the darker elements behind. A colorful calendar hung on the wall, filled with school events, doctor appointments, and soccer practices. Below it, he'd created a chore chart with each child's name and responsibilities. It was simple things like putting away toys and helping with dishes, but it made them feel part of something bigger, part of a family. Grace's artwork decorated one wall, her crayon drawings protected behind dollar store frames. She'd drawn their family, stick figures of varying sizes, all holding hands. Frank featured prominently in every picture, his figure always larger than life, usually wearing what looked like a cape. It made him smile every time he looked at them. The sound of excited footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. The garage door burst open, and the kids tumbled in, their faces bright with excitement. They carried armfuls of toys, Christmas presents from their first real holiday together. "Dad, look what Santa brought us!" Grace held up a stuffed unicorn almost as big as she was, its rainbow mane sparkling in the garage lights. Molly clutched a new set of art supplies, already planning her next masterpiece. "Can I set up my easel in here? Please?" The middle child, Tommy, zoomed around the space with a remote control car, testing its speed on the smooth concrete floor. Frank watched them explore the garage with their new treasures, their laughter echoing off the walls. This wasn't just a place to store tools anymore. It had become something more, a space where memories would be made, where scraped knees would be bandaged, where homework would be finished, and where dreams would take shape. His chest swelled with pride as he watched them play. These weren't the same scared kids he'd pulled from a burning house. They were happy, healthy, and most importantly, they were home. The waiting room of Dr. Sarah Chen's office felt smaller than usual as Frank shifted in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight, and his fingers drummed against his knee. He'd been coming here for 6 weeks now, but the nervousness never quite went away. A potted plant sat in the corner, its leaves catching the morning sunlight. Frank focused on it, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The old him would have laughed at the idea of therapy, would have called it weak. But the old him hadn't had 3 kids depending on him either. "Frank?" Dr. Chen's gentle voice called from her office doorway. "Come on in." He stood up, his boots heavy on the carpeted floor. The office was warm and inviting, with soft blues and greens that reminded him of peaceful places. Dr. Chen sat in her usual chair, her kind eyes watching as he settled into the oversized armchair across from her. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, notepad ready. Frank took a deep breath. "Better, I think. Had a rough night, though. The nightmares came back." "Tell me about them." "Same old stuff. Jake's face, the fights, but this time—" He paused, running a hand through his gray, streaked hair. "This time the kids were there too, watching everything." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's a natural fear, Frank. You're worried about your past affecting them." "Yeah." His voice was rough. "I keep thinking I'm not good enough for them, that somehow my old life is going to poison what we're building. But you're here, Doctor," Chen reminded him. "You're doing the work, that's what matters." Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I started telling Grace about my past yesterday, just little bits, about the motorcycle, about how I used to be angry all the time. She just listened, didn't judge, just held my hand." "How did that make you feel?" "Scared at first. Then, lighter, I guess. Like I wasn't carrying it all alone anymore." They talked about his progress, about the tools he'd learned for managing his anxiety and anger. Frank described how he'd started using the breathing exercises when he felt overwhelmed, how he'd begun journaling at night after the kids went to bed. "I have a suggestion, Doctor," Chen said. "I think it might be helpful to have a family session. All of you together." Frank's stomach tightened. "You think they're ready for that?" "I think you're all ready. The children have been through their own trauma, Frank. Having a safe space to process together could be powerful for all of you." Later that week, Frank returned with all 3 kids. Grace clung to his hand while Molly explored the office, touching the plants and looking at the paintings. The youngest, Tommy, sat on Frank's lap, playing with a toy car from Dr. Chen's collection. "Today," Dr. Chen began, "we're going to do something special. We're going to create a family map." She spread a large piece of paper on the floor, and they all sat around it. Each person got different colored markers. Dr. Chen guided them to draw their feelings, their hopes, their fears. Grace drew a house with a big garage. Molly added a garden full of flowers. Tommy scribbled what he said was their family having a picnic. Frank, with trembling hands, drew a heart around it all. "This is our safe space," Dr. Chen explained. "Everything you're feeling, everything you're hoping for, it all belongs here." Tears welled in Frank's eyes as he watched his children add to their family map. Their drawings overlapped, connected, created something beautiful together. He felt Grace lean against him, her small hand finding his again. "We're fixing our hearts together, aren't we, Dad?" she whispered. Frank squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. In that moment, surrounded by his children, their artwork spreading before them like a road map to healing, he felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried for so long began to lift, making room for something new, something full of hope. Frank stood at the entrance of the county fair, his weathered hands gripping 3 bright yellow tickets. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light, and the air smelled like cotton candy and buttered popcorn. Grace, the youngest, bounced on her toes while holding his hand. Her eyes were wide with wonder at the towering Ferris wheel that spun lazily against the blue sky. "Can we go on that one first, Uncle Frank?" she asked, pointing at the carousel with its prancing horses and cheerful music. Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Sure thing, sweetheart." He wasn't used to seeing pure joy on their faces yet, but it made his heart feel lighter every time. The older kids, Tommy and Sarah, raced ahead through the crowd, weaving between families and food stands. Frank called out, "Stay where I can see you!" His voice carried the authority of someone used to being listened to, but there was a gentleness there now that hadn't existed before. They made their way to the carousel first. Grace picked a white horse with a flowing pink mane, and Frank stood beside her, one hand steady on her back as the ride began to turn. Her giggles mixed with the tinkling music, and Frank found himself laughing too. Tommy wanted to try the ring toss next. Frank watched as the boy's face scrunched up in concentration, his tongue sticking out slightly as he aimed. After several tries and some coaching from Frank, Tommy won a small stuffed penguin. The pride on the boy's face made Frank's chest tighten with emotion. "You did good, kid," Frank said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "Real good." Sarah, always the adventurous one, dragged them to the bumper cars. Frank squeezed himself into one of the small vehicles, his knees nearly touching his chest. The children shrieked with laughter as they repeatedly crashed into his car, ganging up on him in a way that made him feel more loved than targeted. They stopped at a picnic table laden with fair food, hot dogs, French fries, and cotton candy in every color imaginable. Frank watched as the kids devoured their treats, pink and blue sugar sticking to their cheeks. Grace offered him a bite of her cotton candy, and he accepted, making an exaggerated face at the sweetness that sent her into fits of giggles. "This is the best day ever," Sarah declared, her mouth full of hot dog. Yeah? Frank asked, wiping a spot of mustard from Tommy's chin with a napkin. Better than when we went to the zoo? Different kind of best, Grace explained seriously, making Frank smile at her wisdom. As the sun began to set, they made their way through the carnival games. Frank won a giant teddy bear at the strength test, hitting the bell with ease. Instead of keeping it himself, he handed it to Sarah, who hugged it tight against her chest. The sky turned purple and orange, and the festival lights came on, transforming the fairground into a twinkling wonderland. Frank bought them each a glow stick bracelet, and they waved their arms in the growing darkness, creating trails of neon light. On their walk home, the kids skipped ahead, their energy seemingly endless. Their glow stick bracelets bounced in the darkness like fireflies, and their laughter echoed down the quiet street. Frank walked behind them, his hands in his pockets, watching as they played an impromptu game of tag. Grace's pigtails bounced as she ran. Tommy pretended to be a superhero with his jacket flying behind him, and Sarah hugged her new teddy bear while trying to keep up with her siblings. Their joy was simple and pure, untainted by the hardships they'd faced. Frank felt something settle in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like sunshine. For the first time in his life, he felt completely at peace. The weight of his past seemed lighter, overshadowed by the simple happiness of watching his children play. The summer breeze rustled through the leaves of the old maple tree in Frank's backyard. He sat in his favorite weathered lawn chair, watching his children. No longer little ones who needed rescuing from a burning house, but growing into their own people. Molly, now 16, sat cross-legged on the grass, helping Grace with her math homework. The youngest had inherited Frank's determination, refusing to give up until she understood each problem. At 12, Grace's quiet strength reminded Frank of that first day at the shelter when she'd hidden behind the curtain. Tommy, 14, tinkered with an old motorcycle engine on the garage workbench. Frank smiled, remembering how the boy used to trail after him in the garage, asking endless questions about every tool and part. Now he worked with the confidence of someone who knew his way around engines. The transformation in his life still amazed Frank. His arms, once adorned with gang tattoos, now bore new ink, his children's names and important dates that marked their journey together. The garage that was once just his retreat had become a family workshop, filled with projects they tackled together. "Dad!" Grace called out, waving her completed homework triumphantly. The word still made his heart swell, even after all these years. He remembered the first time she'd called him that, how it had felt both terrifying and wonderful. Frank watched as Molly high-fived her sister, their bond stronger than ever. She'd grown into a natural leader, channeling her early maternal instincts into positive directions. The scared little girl who'd once pointed at a burning house was now class president and volunteered at the local youth center. Tommy looked up from his work, grease smeared across his cheek. "Hey, Dad, come check this out." Frank pushed himself up from his chair, his joints a bit stiffer than they used to be. The years of riding had taken their toll, but he wouldn't change a thing about his path. As he walked across the yard, Frank caught sight of the family photos hanging through the kitchen window. Birthday parties, school graduations, camping trips, moments that had slowly replaced the memories of his rougher days. The leather jacket he'd once worn like armor now hung in the closet, a reminder of how far he'd come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Frank reached Tommy at the workbench. His son's eyes sparkled with the same excitement Frank had felt working on his first bike. But unlike Frank at that age, Tommy's future stretched bright and wide before him, unmarked by the kind of choices that had once defined Frank's life. Molly and Grace joined them at the garage, and soon all four were gathered around the engine, with Tommy excitedly explaining his latest discovery. Frank felt the familiar warmth of belonging wash over him as he stood there with his children, their voices mixing with the chirping birds and distant lawnmowers of their peaceful neighborhood. These moments, simple, ordinary, precious, were what he'd been searching for all along, though he hadn't known it that foggy morning when a little girl's words changed his life forever. His journey from Hell's Angel to father hadn't been easy, but watching his children grow, seeing them become people he was proud to know, made every struggle worthwhile. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.